So this was going to be a how-to video explaining how to replace an engine mount on this Mercury Montego, but I was installing it in a different way because sometimes engine mounts come as their own unit, and sometimes you can replace just the bushing. On this example, you can replace either one, and I decided to go with just the bushing because you can get it way cheaper than most of the full engine mount setups. Because this was the first time I was installing it this way, it ended up being less of a this is how you do it, and more of a should you install bushings this way kind of video. So this is a big bushing, and normally you would get a special tool to press the bushing into that upper mount area, and I wanted to see if it could be done without that tool, without any special hydraulic press tools, without any special power tools, and without using a torch either. You could sometimes use the torch to heat up the outside component so it expands, and then the inside component is room temperature, or if you can chill it, even better, because that'll cause it to contract. And then the expanded out portion can let the smaller contracted item go inside of it, and then the temperatures go back to normal and they kind of clamp down on each other. Oh, and one of the other perks about this is that if you are replacing it on this particular car, the automatic transmission and the CVT mounts are actually different mounts, except that sleeve that we're replacing is the same mount, or at least when I looked it up, it was the same mount for both. It was just the round sleeve that goes in, and the bottom part where it attaches the transmission, that metal assembly has to be different in order to fit one or the other. So I'm using a handsaw here. Part of the reason why I'm doing that is because I wanted to try this out without power tools, and it's what I had. I don't have a reciprocating saw. I imagine a reciprocating saw would do this really quickly. It would probably be done in 5 seconds, but you'd have to have room to do it. You'd probably have to flip the blade upside down so that handle that points downward on the saw doesn't get in the way of the engine, or the engine doesn't get in its way. Anyway, doing this by hand took a while, but it made sure I didn't cut too deep in the aluminum part. I made 2 separate cuts so I could knock a piece out of it, and then the remaining big chunk would be able to collapse a little and not be pressing itself up against the walls. And that little piece that I cut out, I didn't even have to cut it all the way out before it allowed this piece to come out of the engine mount. So yeah, all that manual labor, that was the easy part. Look down at how long is left in this video. There's a lot more going on. Since we don't plan on keeping this car very much longer, I decided to go with a very inexpensive budget version. I think it was less than $10 for this piece. And keep that in mind if you're ever buying a car on Facebook Marketplace or something, that if you see a bunch of stuff they just replaced, they didn't stick good stuff on there. They're trying to sell the car, and it looks good if there's all these new parts, but like, it's cheap junk for sure. This new bushing was a little bit too big, so I started out with some rough sandpaper and started sanding off the coating that was on the outside where the bushing is going to be pressed in to the engine mount bracket, and that didn't do the trick, so I started sanding the inside of the engine mount bracket itself. Eventually, I gave up on that, so here's the new set of tools that I ended up using. So yeah, there it is, a power tool now. So it's not a power tool free install, but it's a electric drill. I feel like a lot of people have those. I put this steel brush attachment on so I can eat away at that opening, so I could widen the hole for that bushing to go into. This technique is not what you want to be doing. All that material that you're taking away is going to compromise the integrity of that engine mount. On this particular car, I wasn't too worried about it because this problem was just something that I noticed by looking under the hood. The engine doesn't jolt around or anything. It doesn't actually exhibit any problems. This is just an additional way to hold the engine in place for an even smoother ride. So honestly, I could have left that engine mount broken the way it was and it would have ridden just fine. But that engine mount was cheap. I wanted to make a video, so here we are watching this struggle. Part of what made this take so long is that you have to keep going back and forth between grinding and checking to see if it's going to fit. If you grind too much off, you can't put that material back. You could probably put epoxy in there, but then that mount is stuck in there and you'd have to replace the whole thing if that mount goes bad. I wanted to try to make this happen, and I wanted to do it kind of right at least. Like, I mentioned before, this is not the right way to do it. You don't want to be removing material from an aluminum engine mount because you can weaken it. You may also note that I'm taking away material mostly at the bottom too, because that's where the material is the thickest. Up at the top, it's super thin, and if I took material away from that, then I'd be making it even thinner. Taking away all this material also took a really long time. I ran out of daylight on the first day and ended up doing some more on the second day. I went through at least 2 battery changes on the drill. There are definitely tools out there that would have removed this material a lot faster and even a little more cleanly too, but I didn't happen to have those on me, so this is what I had and this is what I used. Eventually I did get enough material removed that I could fit this in here by pressing it in, and you do want to make sure that it's somewhat difficult to press in, because if it's easy for it to go in, it's probably going to be too loose, and eventually it will be a bad engine mount, but not in a way that you can replace easily. You'd have to replace that whole unit. I was using a pair of these squeeze clamps, which I think I forgot to include in the shot of all my tools. But a C-clamp would have been better because of the way it tightens, but I couldn't find mine, so I ended up having to use these. Again, this is an experience of using what tools are available with a limited scope of tools. Eventually, between those clamps and the hammer I was using, I was able to get it in at least 95% of the way, far enough that I was happy with the results, and I could connect it back up. After that, I had to reattach some stuff that I had to remove and get out of the way for the clamping process. Luckily, the only gasket I encountered was in reusable condition and was one of the types that you can reuse, so I was able to reuse it. But during all this improvising, I had to remove more parts than I expected to, and with all the work that I had to do and all the time involved, it would have probably been about the same amount of time, if not less, to just replace that whole unit. And before you bring up the price of that whole mount assembly compared to just that bushing that we replaced, there's a price difference in the amount of tools that you have to have in order to do one versus the other as well. This mount goes deep into the engine bay, but I imagine once I removed the throttle body during this process, I was already most of the way down there, and I probably didn't have to remove too much more to get to those bolts down at the bottom. I wouldn't have needed to use the clamp, or the drill, or the sandpaper. I wouldn't have needed to use that respirator to make sure I didn't breathe in that aluminum dust. There's a few lessons to be learned here. Don't underestimate how difficult it's going to be to push a metal sleeve bushing in. Before you buy any parts at all, scope out your job and see what you're even able to do, and if there are different ways you can go about doing that job. I was seeing what I could do with tool limitations, and I was lucky to have the tools that I did have when I was doing this job, so be sure to carefully consider the tool collection that you currently have, how much money you have to spend to expand that tool collection to get the job done, and always assume that you may have overlooked a step and you may have to spend more money than you think. I don't want this to discourage anyone from working on a car themselves. Working on your own car can be fun, rewarding, it can be frustrating too, but you get past that and the end result is still rewarding, especially if there was some frustration in there and you had to overcome something to get the job done. Limitations mean you have to think outside the box, and that can be rewarding too, and sometimes buying a new tool to help you solve this problem means you have another tool in your collection that you can go, oh, I can use that next time I'm working on that, and it'll save me a little more time there too. There are plenty of tools that I own that I thought I'd use once or twice, and I use all the time. But some car repairs are very difficult, and as cars get newer and more advanced, they're getting more difficult to do correctly too. Sometimes you can do the mechanical work, but there's still something in the computer that has to be told, okay, things are fine now. A lot of us just don't have access to that. So you end up having to take it to a mechanic anyway, and sometimes it's just easier to just do that. There are even some cases where it's actually less expensive to do that. Just be smart and safe about your DIY car repairs. Hopefully this made deciding whether or not you should work on your car just a little bit easier, and I hope to see you in the next Car Simplified video. Thanks for watching.